is everywhere in society. It runs rampant. We constantly see malicious acts of man against man, woman against woman, and we constantly see, even possibly worse than that, natural disasters. We see earthquakes, hurricanes, volcano eruptions, all sorts of terrible events of cataclysmic weather. And all of this leads us to a very important question that we must ask ourselves, and that sadly is not answered very well quite often. If God is good, then why does he allow so much suffering and evil? Why is there so much suffering and evil in the world if this God that people claim to serve is good? And it's a very important question. And it's a question, like I already stated, is very poorly answered most often. But I think that there is an adequate answer to this question. And I think it's important that we share this adequate answer. But before I get to that, we have to break it down. So first, starting with the problem of evil. Let's just address evil as a subject. Let's address evil on its own. We have to first define evil. What is evil? Well, the great thinkers of the past, two of the greatest, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who are both philosophers and theologians, both very influential in secular and religious societies, both gave two Latin words to describe evil. One meaning privation, that word being privatio, and one meaning negation, that word being negatio. So evil is a negation of good. Just like injustice is a negation of justice. Wherever evil is, in the same sense, it's a privation of good. Wherever there is a lack of good, there is sure to be evil. Evil takes away from good. So we understand that evil is a negation and privation, but what it is a negation and privation of is good. So first, before you have evil, you must have good. In order to have the quality of evil, which we do clearly see in the world, we must first have the quality of good. It's somewhat analogous to a virus. A host cell can stand alone, whereas a virus can't. That virus can only exist inside of that host cell. It must first attach to that host cell as a parasite of that host cell, as a parasite of health. Similarly, evil is a parasite of good. And good can stand all alone by itself, but evil cannot stand alone by itself. You must first have good. But this leads us to something very interesting: the standard for good and evil. And I'm going to say a very bold statement, and I'm sure you might at first not appreciate this statement, but just hear what I'm saying. In order for there to be good, and in order for there to be evil, there must be an objective standard by which to measure the two. So in order for there to be a privation of good, there has to be first a privation of good, which is evil. There must first be a standard for good, and that must be absolutely good. And I propose to you that that goodness is God. Think about it in this terms. If there's no God, if we ultimately just die and answer only to ourselves for what we've done, or merely to the law or the government for what we've done, morality is quite interpersonal. It's really just preference. What I might call evil, you might call good, or what I might call good, you might call evil. It's really just me, my preference versus your preference. And in truth, we can't say one preference is better than the other, because if there's no standard by which to measure it, then we can't judge one standard against another. They're really just quite the same. So when we ask ourselves the question of evil, we have to first ask ourselves, what is the standard for good? And I would like to see if you can provide for me a standard of good besides God. What standard of good is there? Human success, but that's not necessarily a standard of good. That just might be the best interest of the human race is for the best interest of us all. That doesn't necessarily make it good. What is the standard for good? In order for you to accuse God of being bad for allowing evil, you have to have a morality to accuse him of. But if there is no objective morality, how can you do so? Similarly with the question of suffering. Suffering is just a variation of the question of why does God allow suffering? Just a variation of the question, why does God allow evil? Suffering is evil. But suffering cannot be evil unless there's an absolute standard by which we measure evil and good. In order to measure evil, we must first measure good. So for instance, take this analogy. You can have a car stand alone by itself. but rust can be a parasite in that car. And you can take all the rust out of the car and the car will stand, but you can't take all the car out of the rust. The rust can't exist without that host, without that body, right? Similarly, you cannot have evil without good. And that goodness is only explained within an understanding of and an object of God. So with the question of suffering and evil, you have to confess that in order for suffering and evil to be wrong, there must in turn be a God. And suffering, and another case to come out against suffering, how is suffering wrong if you and I are just the results of a pointless cataclysmic event? There's no meaning to your life, nor is there any meaning to ours. In fact, most atheists, or well, many are more than happy to admit this. For instance, take Richard Dawkins, the foremost world's leading atheist. He said this. He said, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. He then says, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Look at those words. The world's leading atheist said this: no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. Nothing but pitiless indifference. But in a way, I respect Richard Dawkins for that statement because he's staying logically consistent with his beliefs. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, famously came out with the Nietzschean philosophy. Life is just purposeless. Morality is simply the figment of your imagination, is simply an illusion. So in order for evil and suffering to be wrong, there must be a standard for good. And what is that standard? Well, it must be God. There is no other standard by which we can measure evil by. But now that we can understand that, we do want to address the question head on: why does God allow suffering and evil? And that's a very tough question. It's one that is hard to give an adequate answer. And to be frankly honest with you, in your personal life, the suffering and evil you've experienced, I can't tell you exactly why you face that. I can't tell you exactly why God has allowed you to go up against that. I can't tell you. I believe you can find out. I believe God can tell you, but I cannot tell you. But here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that there's a meaning to it and that there's a purpose to it. Joseph, when he was sold into slavery by his brothers, at first was a slave. He worked his way up the ladder, was then thrown into prison. But then he was made the second in command of all of Egypt. And when his brothers came back to him because they needed his help, he told them this. He said, what you meant for evil, God intended for good. And for those of you who are suffering, for those of you who are facing evil, for those of you who have been the victims of injustice, God is a just God, and he will exact justice. God has a purpose for the suffering you've experienced, and God has the answer to the question of why he's allowed it to happen. But you first have to surrender to him in order to see this. God says that all things work according to good for those who love him. That's almost the most popular Bible verse every year. So, can I tell you exactly why you've experienced suffering and evil? Not exactly. But this I can also tell you. I know where evil is going to end up. Evil will one day be ultimately defeated, forever locked up, forever vanished, forever vanquished, forever defeated. But that promise will only be there for the Christian who's accepted the ultimate form of good, which is God. And I hope that after you finish watching this video, we give some thought to that and see the standard by which we must measure the truth. See the standard by which we must measure good and evil. Please give this some thought. Thank you for joining me, guys.